In a lively city park bustling with excitement, an unimaginable event unfolded, leaving everyone in shock. The summer sun shone brightly over the annual festival, where families wandered between colorful booths, the air filled with the sweet aroma of popcorn and cotton candy. Children's laughter mingled with the soft tunes of music drifting from the carnival stage. Among the crowd was 8-year-old Maya, her wheelchair rolling steadily along the gravel path. Her chair, adorned with stickers of her favorite animals, seemed as cheerful as her beaming smile. Maya had been born with cerebral palsy, but she refused to let it define her. Her parents had taught her to embrace life with courage and optimism, and today was no different. Her father Derek had brought her to the festival, promising a day of joy and play. Maya couldn't wait to reach the playground, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the swings and slides ahead. From a bench nearby, Derek sipped his coffee, watching his daughter with pride. As an FBI agent, he had faced many dark moments in life, but Maya's resilience was his constant source of hope. He leaned back, savoring the rare moment of calm in their otherwise busy lives. But the tranquility didn't last long. Maya's wheelchair approached the playground's entrance when a tall, uniformed figure stepped into her path. Officer Jake Thompson, a local policeman known for his harsh demeanor, blocked her way. His stern face twisted into something much darker as he glared at her. Maya paused, unsure. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, trying to steer her chair around him, but each time she moved the officer shifted, keeping her from passing. His voice cut through the festival's lively sounds like a cold wind. "You don't belong here," he snapped, his tone sharp and biting. His words froze Maya in place. She had faced moments of unkindness before, but this was different. This was hatred. Fear flickered in her eyes, but she managed a small, defiant whisper. "I just want to play." Officer Thompson's scowl deepened. "Get out of here, brat," he barked, stepping closer. His towering figure cast a menacing shadow over her. Maya's small hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair as she tried to reverse, but the gravel made it nearly impossible. Across the park, Derek's peaceful moment shattered. He noticed the tension near the playground and saw the unmistakable blue of Maya's wheelchair. His heart sank as he took in the scene. Without a second thought, he abandoned his coffee and sprinted toward his daughter, dread pounding in his chest. Before Derek could reach them, the unthinkable happened. Officer Thompson's hand shot up and struck Maya across the face. The sound echoed through the park, silencing the festival's joyous hum. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her stinging cheek, her wide eyes filled with shock and hurt. Time seemed to stop as the weight of the act settled over the crowd. Parents pulled their children close, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire. Several bystanders pulled out their phones, recording the horrifying moment. The festival's cheerful atmosphere had turned into one of stunned silence and growing outrage. Derek reached Maya just seconds after the slap, his protective instincts taking over. He crouched beside her, checking her cheek for any injury, his hands trembling with anger and concern. Turning to face the officer, Derek's voice was cold and firm. "What do you think you're doing?" The crowd closed in, murmurs of discontent growing louder. People began confronting Officer Thompson, demanding answers. Some called out for justice, their voices ringing with indignation. Maya's resilience and courage in the face of cruelty had touched everyone who witnessed the event. The day, meant to be one of celebration, had taken a dark turn, but the community's response showed unity against such injustice. The officers' actions didn't just harm a little girl, they sparked a collective determination to stand up for what was right. And as the crowd rallied around Maya and her father, it was clear that her life, her unyielding spirit, would not be dimmed by cruelty. Derek reached his daughter's side just as tears began to stream down her cheeks, mixing with the red mark that had appeared on her face. A surge of raw anger overwhelmed him, hotter than anything he had ever felt. He positioned himself firmly between Maya and the officer, his fists clenched tightly, his entire body trembling with barely restrained rage. "What do you think you're doing?" Derek demanded, his voice sharp and trembling with a mix of fear and fury. He locked eyes with Officer Jake Thompson, his gaze filled with such intensity that it made the officer falter for a moment. However, the anger in Derek's voice seemed to stoke the officer's arrogance further. "Stay out of this," Jake snapped, trying to hold on to his bravado. But the crowd was no longer on his side. Whispers turned into shouts as the murmurs of outrage grew louder. More people gathered, their faces a mix of shock and anger as they witnessed the escalating confrontation. Derek glanced back at Maya, who was sobbing quietly, her small body trembling in her wheelchair. In that moment, he made a silent vow. He would not let this act of cruelty go unanswered. Turning back to the officer, his voice dropped to a dangerous tone, filled with an unshakable promise. "You think you can hurt my daughter and walk away? I swear you'll pay for this. I'll make sure of it." For a brief moment, fear flashed across Officer Thompson's face. He hadn't realized who he was dealing with. An FBI agent, a man with the power and determination to fight back. Before he could respond, the distant wail of sirens cut through the tense air, growing louder with each passing second. As the sound of approaching squad cars filled the park, Derek remained steadfast, his protective instincts driving him. The festival, once filled with laughter and joy, had descended into chaos. The air was thick with tension, the once cheerful atmosphere replaced by anger and disbelief. 2 police cars pulled up, and several officers stepped out, moving swiftly toward the scene. Their presence caused a ripple through the crowd, but the onlookers stood firm, their phones capturing every moment. The community's growing anger was palpable, a storm brewing in solidarity with Derek and Maya. Recognizing their colleague in trouble, the newly arrived officers moved to stand beside Jake, forming a defensive line. One of them stepped forward, addressing the gathering crowd. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone attempting to convey authority. Derek didn't back down. Standing tall in front of his daughter, his voice was steady and resolute as he replied, "This officer struck my daughter, and I will not let this go unanswered." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder in support of Derek and Maya. The officers' actions had done more than harm an innocent child, they had sparked a collective determination for justice. For Derek, this was only the beginning of a battle he was ready to fight. A fight for his daughter, for their community, and for what was right. One officer stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster at his side, his eyes darting nervously between Derek and the growing, enraged crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice tinged with unease. Derek took a deep breath, forcing himself to maintain composure, though the anger still simmered beneath his calm exterior. He gestured toward Maya, who sat in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face, and her cheek still red from the blow. "What's going on is that this man, this officer, attacked my daughter without any reason, and I want to know why," Derek said, his voice steady but laced with controlled fury. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that the situation was spiraling out of control. They turned to Jake, who attempted to put on a defiant expression, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "She was obstructing the path," Jake stammered, the words coming out weak and unconvincing. Even he seemed to realize how feeble his excuse sounded. The crowd erupted. Shouts of outrage rose like a tidal wave. "You think that justifies hitting a child?" someone yelled. "She's just a little girl," cried another. The voices merged into a unified roar of indignation, and the officers visibly struggled to maintain their composure as they faced the fury of the onlookers. Seeing the opportunity, Derek stepped forward, his voice rising above the chaos, clear and unwavering. "Everyone here saw what happened," he said, sweeping his hand toward the crowd. "They saw you strike a child without cause, and now you're trying to justify it? There's no excuse for what you did. You will be held accountable." His words struck a chord with the crowd. A few people began to chant, their voices gaining strength with each repetition. "Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya!" The chant rolled through the park like a wave, shaking the officers who had thought they could control the narrative. Jake's face drained of color as he glanced nervously at the gathering storm of voices. Amid the turmoil, Derek knelt beside Maya, his expression softening. He gently wiped away her tears, wrapping an arm around her trembling frame. She clung to him, her small body shaking against his chest. "It's okay, baby. I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I won't let him hurt you again." Maya nodded, but the fear in her wide eyes pierced Derek's heart like a knife. This moment had changed everything. The innocence of a sunny day in the park was gone, replaced by a harsh and bitter reality. But as Derek held his daughter, surrounded by a community united in outrage, he felt a spark of hope. Hope that this injustice would not go unnoticed, that people would stand together against such cruelty. The arriving officers, sensing the crowd's anger reaching a boiling point, decided to take action. They moved to arrest Jake, their decision more about defusing the tension than delivering justice. As they cuffed him, Jake cast one last defiant glare at Derek and Maya, but his look held no power, only desperation, a feeble attempt to cling to the authority he had so thoroughly abused. Derek met Jake's glare with unyielding resolve, his expression a silent promise. "You'll answer for this," he called after the retreating officer, his voice carrying a weight that left no room for doubt. With Jake taken away, the crowd began to disperse, though the energy of the moment lingered. Parents clutched their children tightly, their trust in those sworn to protect them shaken. A few people approached Derek, offering words of support and vowing to share their recordings of the incident. "Thank you," Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to Maya, who looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. Forcing a smile, he stroked her hair gently. "We're going to fight this, Maya. I promise you, we won't let him get away with what he did." Maya nodded slowly, her small hands clutching the sides of her wheelchair. Despite the lingering fear in her heart, her father's words gave her a sense of strength, a feeling that she wasn't alone. As they prepared to leave the park, she held on to that thought, knowing her father would do whatever it took to protect her. Derek gently lifted Maya from her wheelchair and placed her in the back seat of their car, securing her seatbelt with a tenderness that belied the fury still burning inside him. As they drove away, the echoes of the crowd's chants followed them, a reminder that their fight for justice was only just beginning. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Derek walked toward his home, the weight of the day's events heavy on his shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy, but he felt an unshakable resolve building within him. For Maya, for justice, and for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of those sworn to protect them, he would fight. This act of cruelty would not fade into obscurity. He would ensure that it sparked change, not only for his family but for the entire community. With the unwavering determination of a father, Derek vowed to see this through. The morning after the incident, the world outside Derek's home was eerily still, but the storm it had unleashed was just beginning. Videos of the confrontation between Officer Jake Thompson and Maya had spread like wildfire on social media, clips capturing the officer's violent act, Derek's confrontation, and the crowd's chants of "justice for Maya" filled timelines, igniting a national conversation about police brutality and systemic bias. What had started as a local story had quickly become a symbol of something much larger. Derek sat at the kitchen table, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from reporters, activists, and strangers who had seen the videos. Maya was upstairs, trying to rest after a sleepless night. The mark on her cheek was still visible, a painful reminder of what had happened. Derek exhaled deeply, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the messages. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the look of fear on Maya's face as the officer's hand came down. That memory burned within him, fueling his resolve. He had already reached out to a lawyer, a trusted friend from his law enforcement days who specialized in civil rights cases. Filing a formal complaint against Officer Thompson was the first step, but Derek knew it wasn't enough. This fight was bigger than one man's actions. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed someone like Thompson to wear a badge. As Derek sifted through his messages, one in particular caught his eye. It was an invitation to speak at a rally organized by local advocacy groups in support of Maya. They wanted him to share their story and demand accountability not just for Officer Thompson, but for the entire police department. Derek hesitated. He knew that stepping into the public eye could make him a target. But then he thought of Maya, and the trust in her eyes when he promised her justice. With a determined nod, he typed out his reply. "I'll be there." 2 days later, Derek stood on the steps of City Hall, facing a sea of people that filled the square. Hundreds had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Maya," and "End police brutality." The air buzzed with a mix of anger, frustration, and unity. Derek's heart pounded, but he pushed his nerves aside. This moment wasn't about him. It was about something far greater. As he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him with anticipation. The weight of their hope pressed on his shoulders, but it also gave him strength. He had prepared his speech, but standing here, he knew he had to speak from the heart. "My name is Derek Thompson," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I am an FBI agent, a member of this community, and most importantly, a father. 2 days ago, my 8-year-old daughter Maya was attacked. She was attacked by someone who was supposed to protect her." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Derek paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about what happened to Maya," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "This is about a system that allows people like Officer Jake Thompson to act without fear of consequences. It's about a system that sees our children as threats instead of recognizing their humanity." He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. "I am here today because I made a promise to my daughter. I promised her that I would not let this go unanswered. And now, I am asking all of you to stand with us, to demand accountability, to demand change." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their voices echoing off the buildings around them. A chant began to rise again, "Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya!" It swelled like a wave, rolling through the square and into the streets beyond. Derek's heart swelled with hope as he looked out at the crowd. Families with children, local activists, and community leaders stood together, their faces united in determination. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs too. As Derek stepped back from the microphone, he felt the warmth of Maya's small hand in his own. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with both sadness and strength. He knelt down beside her, whispering softly, "We're not alone, Maya. We're going to fight this, together." Maya nodded, her grip tightening around his hand. Despite everything, she felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible, and as the chants of the crowd roared on, she held on to that hope, knowing that her father and her community would not stop until justice was served. As the rally continued, speakers from local civil rights organizations stepped onto the stage, sharing their own stories of injustice and calling for sweeping reforms within the police department. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of urgency and determination that left no room for silence or inaction. By the time the rally came to a close, Derek could feel it in his bones. Their voices had made an impact. In the days that followed, the city seemed to shift before Derek's eyes. News outlets picked up the story, replaying footage of the incident alongside interviews with witnesses. Headlines like, "Local FBI agent demands justice for daughter's assault and community rallies against police brutality," dominated screens and newspapers. National media began to highlight the case, drawing attention to the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Jake Thompson to abuse their power unchecked. Under intense scrutiny, the police department announced that Jake Thompson had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. But for many, this action felt like too little too late. Calls for greater accountability and transparency echoed across the city. Derek's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, as well as pleas to keep the pressure on. Meanwhile, the local community came together in ways Derek had never seen before. Small businesses displayed signs in their windows, reading, "We stand with Maya." Families gathered for peaceful candlelight marches through the streets, their glowing lights a quiet but powerful statement. Each evening, Derek and Maya would watch the news coverage together. Though the sight of the videos still brought tears to her eyes, she began to look up at her father with a glimmer of hope. "Will it change, Daddy?" she asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek knelt beside her, taking her small hand in his. "I don't know how long it will take, sweetie," he said honestly. "But I know we're going to fight for it, and we're not alone." As the investigation into Jake Thompson's actions progressed, Derek's lawyer gathered testimony from witnesses who had been at the park that day. Their accounts painted a damning picture of the officer's behavior. Reading through the statements, Derek felt a mix of anger and relief. For too long, the voices of those who had suffered similar experiences had been ignored. Now, they had a chance to be heard. But the fight wasn't without challenges. As the case gained more attention, Derek began to receive anonymous threats, warnings to back down, to stop stirring up trouble. Each message only strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Maya anymore. He was fighting for every child who had been made to feel powerless and small. One evening, while reviewing a batch of new messages, Derek received a call from a local activist group. They asked if he would consider leading a broader movement for police reform in the city. He hesitated, glancing toward the stairs leading to Maya's room. He had never considered himself an activist, but in that moment he realized this was exactly where he needed to be. He agreed, knowing this fight was far from over. It was no longer just about one officer or one incident, it was about systemic change, and as he thought of Maya's hopeful smile, he knew it was a battle worth fighting. The day of the trial arrived under a pale wintry sky, the air sharp with a chill that contrasted starkly with the heated emotions of the case. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Maya" and "End Police Brutality." The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, as though the entire city was collectively holding its breath, waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Derek sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw set in determination. Beside him, Maya sat quietly, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden bench. Her cheek, now healed, bore no physical scars, but Derek knew the emotional wounds ran deep. He offered her a reassuring smile, and she returned it tentatively. Across the aisle sat Jake Thompson. His face was a mask of barely concealed bitterness, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He kept glancing nervously around the room, taking in the reporters, the cameras, and the faces of those who had come to witness his reckoning. The smug confidence he had worn so baldly on the day of the park incident was gone, replaced by a raw, undeniable fear. Derek watched him closely, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. This was the beginning of something much larger than a single trial. It was a fight for accountability, for change, and for the future of his daughter and countless others. And Derek was ready. As the judge entered the courtroom, everyone rose in unison, and the trial began. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla Ruiz, wasted no time laying out the charges against Officer Jake Thompson: assault, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. She spoke with a calm authority that commanded the room's attention. "This case is not just about one officer's actions," she declared, her voice cutting through the silence. "It is about the abuse of power. It is about the rights of every citizen to feel safe in their community. Maya Thompson was not safe, and that is why we are here today." Derek sat quietly, watching as the jury listened intently, their faces a mixture of curiosity and resolve. He knew they held Maya's future in their hands, and prayed they would see past the lies that had so often shielded men like Jake Thompson from accountability. The first witness was called to the stand, a middle-aged man who had been at the park that day with his children. He described with a trembling voice the moment he saw Officer Thompson strike Maya. "There was no reason for it," he said, his eyes fixed on the jury. "She was just a little girl and he hit her like she was some kind of threat." The defense attorney attempted to undermine the man's credibility, questioning whether he could have seen everything clearly from where he stood, but the witness held firm, refusing to be shaken. "I know what I saw," he said, his voice steady, "and so did everyone else." More witnesses followed: parents, teenagers, and even a local business owner. Each testimony painted a vivid picture of that day, a picture of an officer abusing his power in broad daylight. Derek felt a sense of vindication building as each new voice added weight to the case. The prosecutor then presented the bystander videos, each one showing the same harrowing scene: Jake Thompson towering over Maya, his hand coming down in a slap that echoed through the courtroom just as it had echoed through the park. Gasps filled the room as the footage played, and Derek could see the jury's expressions harden. The defense grew more desperate with each passing day. Jake's lawyer argued that his client was a dedicated officer under immense stress, simply trying to maintain order in a chaotic situation. "He made a mistake, yes," the lawyer said, his tone almost pleading, "but should his entire life be ruined because of a momentary lapse in judgment?" Carla Ruiz was ready, turning to Jake as he took the stand. Her questions were precise and unwavering. "Officer Thompson, did you feel threatened by an 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair?" she asked, her tone slicing through his attempts to deflect. Jake hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. I thought she might cause trouble. The park was crowded and I had to ensure everyone's safety." "By striking a child," Ruiz shot back, her eyebrows raised. "Is that what you believe your duty entails?" Montes. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Derek saw several jurors exchange glances. Jake's lawyer rose to object, but the damage was done. Ruiz's words hung in the air, unshakable. When it was Derek's turn to testify, he rose from his seat, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on him. As he took the stand, he caught a glimpse of Maya, her hands gripping the edge of the bench, her face a mask of quiet determination. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. "Tell us what you saw that day, Mr. Thompson," Ruiz prompted, her voice gentle but firm. Derek focused on the jury, speaking clearly as he described the moment he saw the officer strike his daughter. He recounted the fury and fear that had surged through him and the shock that rippled through the park as people realized what had happened. "I'm an FBI agent," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I've seen a lot in my line of work, but I never imagined I'd see my own daughter attacked by someone who was supposed to protect her. And I'll never forget the look on her face when it happened. That's the moment she learned that the people we teach our children to trust can sometimes be the ones who hurt them the most." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He could see Maya's eyes glistening with tears, and he forced himself to stay strong. This was for her, for all the children who deserved better. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his testimony settling over everyone present. For the first time, Derek felt like the tide was turning. They were finally being heard. The courtroom was silent as Derek finished his testimony. Carla Ruiz gave him a small nod of gratitude as he returned to his seat. Derek's heart ached, but he felt a sense of relief. He had spoken his truth, and now the decision lay in the jury's hands. In her closing arguments, Carla Ruiz spoke with a passion that resonated through the room. "Maya Thompson is not a threat," she began, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "She is a child. A child whose only wish that day was to play in a park, like any other child. But Officer Thompson saw her differently. He saw her as less than, as someone he could dismiss and harm without consequence. Today, we ask you to show him and the system that allowed this, that such actions will not be tolerated." Jake's lawyer made a final plea for leniency, arguing that the officer had learned from his mistake and deserved a chance to make amends. But the jury's expressions remained impassive, their thoughts hidden behind furrowed brows and tight lips. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as the foreman stood and cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Jake Thompson, guilty of all charges." A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by a swell of murmured voices. Derek closed his eyes for a moment, gripping Maya's hand tightly. He felt her squeeze back, and when he looked down, he saw a small smile, brave, tentative, but real. The judge set a date for sentencing, promising that justice would be served. As Jake was led out of the courtroom, his face was pale, his shoulders hunched. He glanced back at Derek and Maya one last time. There was no defiance left in his eyes, only the dull acceptance of a man who had finally been held accountable. Derek watched him go, knowing this was just the beginning of a long road, but as he turned to Maya and saw the hope in her eyes, he knew they had taken an important step, a step toward a future where she could believe in justice again. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in a wave of celebration that echoed through the city streets. Derek stepped into the sunlight, holding Maya close, feeling the warmth of the day and the promise of a new beginning. The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind of change for the Thompson family and the city. Media outlets continued to cover the fallout from the trial, and as the sentencing date approached, discussions about police reform grew louder. But for Derek and Maya, the most important battles were fought at home, in the quiet moments between the chaos. Maya, once hesitant to leave the safety of her room, had begun to reclaim her life. Derek watched with a mix of pride and heartache as she ventured outside, rejoining her friends at the park. Though the shadows of that day still lingered in her eyes, he knew that time would help heal the wounds. There was silence after the first March play until the crowd removed from the stage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Derek and Maya sat together on their porch, gazing out at the peaceful street that had become a symbol of their new beginning. A cool breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the distant sounds of a city still grappling with change. "Daddy," Maya said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her voice was small but steady, like she was testing its strength. Do you think things are really going to get better?" Derek turned to her, taking in the hopeful glimmer in her eyes. He wanted to promise her that the world would be different, that people like Officer Thompson would never again be allowed to hurt children like her. but he knew change was slow, and the road ahead uncertain. So instead he chose honesty, the kind he had always shared with her. "I think it's going to be hard, Maya," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I believe we've already made a difference, and if we keep fighting, things will get better, not just for us, but for everyone." She nodded, absorbing his words. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, finding comfort in his presence. They stayed like that for a while, watching the stars blink into view, finding peace in the simplicity of the moment. The day of Jake Thompson's sentencing arrived with a mixture of tension and anticipation. The courtroom was filled once more, but this time the mood was different. The uncertainty of the trial had given way to a quiet determination, a belief that justice would finally be served. Derek and Maya sat in their usual place, surrounded by familiar faces, activists, friends, and community members who had become like a second family. Jake entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his once defiant expression now replaced with one of resignation. He barely glanced at Derek and Maya as he took his seat, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his choices. For a moment Derek felt a pang of pity for the man, pity for the life he had wasted on hate and prejudice. But then he thought of Maya. Of the pity was replaced by a quiet resolve. The judge read through the charges and the jury's findings, his voice echoing through the room. When he finally announced the sentence, a significant prison term for abuse of power and assault, Derek felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just about punishing Jake, it was about sending a message. Actions like his would not go unanswered. There would be accountability even for those who had once believed themselves untouchable. As the gavel came down, sealing the sentence, Derek reached for Maya's hand. She squeezed it tightly, her expression a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and something new: hope. He bent down to whisper in her ear, his voice barely audible above the murmurs in the courtroom. "We did it, Maya. We kept our promise." Maya looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered back, "for everything." The days that followed brought a sense of renewal. The police department announced a series of reforms, including mandatory racial sensitivity training and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to investigate cases of police misconduct. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a promise that the city was willing to change. Derek found himself speaking at more community meetings, sharing Maya's story and advocating for further reforms. He knew his work was far from over, but each meeting, each new face in the crowd, gave him hope that real progress was possible. One afternoon, as Derek returned home from one such meeting, he found Maya in the living room, surrounded by papers and art supplies. She was working on a school project that had grown into something much more. On the poster in front of her, bold letters read, "Stand up for what's right." She looked up at him with a shy smile, holding up her poster. "Do you think this will help, Daddy? I want to share my story with my class. I want them to know that it's okay to speak up, even when it's hard." Derek felt a lump form in his throat as he knelt beside her, taking in the words she had written. "I think it's perfect, Maya. And I think it's going to make a difference, just like you have." As summer gave way to autumn, the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars left by the events of that day in the park had not fully healed, but the community had found a way to move forward. The rallies had quieted, but the conversations continued. In homes, in schools, in town halls, people were learning, questioning, and slowly but surely changing. Derek and Maya returned to the park where it had all begun, a place that now stood as a symbol of both pain and resilience. They walked together down the familiar paths, past the playground where children played once more, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. Derek watched as Maya rolled her wheelchair over the gravel path, her movements confident, her face lit with a peace he hadn't seen in months. They stopped near the swings, where a small plaque had been placed, a gesture from the community to honor Maya's courage. It read, "In recognition of all who stand for justice." Maya traced the words with her fingers, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Do you like it?" Derek asked gently, kneeling beside her. Maya nodded, her eyes shining. "It means a lot. It means that what happened, it mattered, and that people cared." Derek wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close as they watched the sunset together, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple. In that moment, he felt a sense of closure, a chapter ending and a new one beginning. They had faced the darkness, and though the shadows still lingered, they had found a way to bring light back into their lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Derek took Maya's hand in his, feeling the warmth of her small fingers. Together, they looked forward, knowing that the future was uncertain, but that they had the strength to face it. Side by side, and never alone. Thank you for following Maya and Derek's journey. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your voice matters, and together we can stand up for justice. Stay tuned for more stories that will move and empower you.